Hey guys, and welcome to this week's small group. Now today we're asking the question, what if my work life is unacceptable? We are going to be able to come to the conclusion that we need to be humble and thrive. That is what God has called us to do. Now our last small group was all about the way things were, how God intended things to be when He created everything. But today we're going to talk about the way things are, how things got so messed up, and what we are supposed to do about it. Now, in order just to break the ice in our small group, I'm sure that every one of us has a horror story from work. And so tell your small group a horrible work story when work was unbearable to you. And I want everybody in the group to participate, even if it's a short story. And what did you end up doing about the situation? Now, in a moment, we're going to open up to Genesis chapter 3. And in the very first verse, we're going to see that there's a talking snake. So how do we justify that before we even get into it? I think sometimes we as modern people, we read it and we go, wow, look at how stupid the ancient people were. They thought that snakes talked. And sometimes I think we're pretty arrogant and we think we've got everything figured out. The truth of the matter is, those ancient people had a lot more experience with snakes than most of us will ever have. I mean, unless you're a zoologist that spends all their time with snakes, they knew that snakes don't talk. Clearly, they understood that this was a story of how Satan is being depicted as a crafty serpent, deceiving and tempting people to do things, the opposite things from what God wanted them to do. So go ahead and read Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Who are the potential serpents in your workplace? And what are the messages that these serpents spread when it comes to work? Which of these messages tempts you the most? You know, there are going to be times when we mess up at work. Sometimes it's unintentional. Sometimes we give in to those serpent messages. But the question is, what are you going to do about it once you mess up? I think you're going to find it hilarious how the reactions of people today actually mimic the reactions of Adam and Eve. In the Bible, read Genesis chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. How was Adam and Eve's initial reaction similar to the reaction of people today who know that they've done something wrong? Then the second question, what was Adam and Eve's reaction to being caught when they got busted? And how is that similar to how people act today? And if you can, be creative and come up with the funny names for reaction number 1 and reaction number 2. If I had to come up with a funny name for their first reaction, it would be the pathetic cover-up. I mean, really? Fig leaves sewn together as clothes? How did they ever think that that was going to work, right? And the second one would be the blame game, which is a game that I think every wife wants their husband to play. You know, completely throw your wife under the bus. Isn't it ironic how sometimes that's exactly how it looks at our job? A lot of times we get found out and we end up acting like Adam and Eve, or we try to cover up the times that we messed up. Next, I want you to read Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 through 21. And this is going to be our advanced question. Now, an advanced question is something that if you and your small group, if nobody really knows how to answer it, just skip over it. It's okay, you can skip it. But if your small group is up to the challenge and you've got some people who have been trained theologically, go ahead and try to answer this question. How is verse 14 theologically significant in view of the work of Jesus that would come thousands of years later? And the regular question is, what were the curses that would take away the blessing of work? Next question, how have you seen the blessing of your specific work being spoiled by the fall? The fall meaning when humankind began to sin and ruined what God had created. And now for our second advanced question. You can skip over it if you want. Why is it significant that Adam and Eve's clothes were made of animal skin instead of the fig leaves? And what does it say about the cost of sin? So we see how God created work in the first place so that we can join with Him and participate in the beauty of God's creation. That's the way things were. But now, after the fall, everything has fallen apart. It's corrupted our work. The system is broken. So the question is, what do we do about it? In order to answer that, we're going to skip ahead thousands of years into Jewish history. We're going to read from the book of Jeremiah, but let me give you some context. They had established the nation of Israel for a while, and for a while they were the superpower of the world. But eventually, because of their sin, God allowed another superpower by the name of Babylon to capture them and take them into captivity into the city of Babylon against their will. And so here the Jews were experiencing the effects of the fall and of their own sin. And some of the false prophets were saying, don't worry, God's going to save us. But Jeremiah tells the people, don't listen to them. They're liars. God is not going to rescue us. And this is how He wants us to respond to the effects of the fall and of our sin. Read Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 through 14. What about verse 7 would have been shocking for an Israelite captive in Babylon? And in what ways are we as Christians like Israelite captives? And how are we not like them? I want you to see that as Christians, we don't belong in this world. This is a world full of sin and death, and we have been freed. For those of us who have said yes to Jesus, we have been freed from sin and death. We belong in the world that God created from the beginning, not this messed up version of it now. So we are like the foreign captives in this world now. So what can we as Christians learn from these passages as we work in this broken world? And if you could go back to the unbearable work situation that we talked about in the beginning of this small group session and do things differently, what would you do? I'd like for us to close with this last question. In what small way might you be able to represent God this week in the way that you do your work? And after you all answer that question, I'm going to ask that you close in prayer. Ask God to give us the wisdom and bravery to be different in our work. And never forget that God has called us to be humble and thrive. Have a great rest of your small group, and we'll see you next week.